American Anthropological Association produced a short video providing an overview of how prevailing ideas in science, government, and culture intersected throughout history to shape American concepts of race today.
Jefferson wrote in 1776 in Notes on the State of Virginia, quote, "Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind." Unquote. Scientists were among those who were influenced by these ideas and began to develop their own theories about race. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists influenced by Enlightenment philosophers developed a system of categorizing things in nature, including humans. Although Carolus Linnaeus was the first to develop a biological classification system, it was German scientist Johann Blumenbach who first introduced a race-based classification of humans, which established a framework for analyzing race and racial differences for the next 100 years. By the 19th century, the debate over race centered around two theories. One theory was that different races represented different species. The other was that humans were one species and that race represented variation in the human species, a view that was compatible with the teachings of the Bible. Among those who espoused the multiple species theory, or polygyny, were Philadelphia physician Samuel Morton and European scholar Louis Agassiz. Their work was popular in the mid-19th century. The most prominent scientist who believed in monogeny, that all humans were one species, was Charles Darwin. By the mid-19th century, scientific debates over race had entered the mainstream culture and served to justify slavery and mistreatment. Some, like plantation doctor Samuel Cartwright, tried to explain the tendency of slaves to run away by coining the term drapetomania and prescribed whipping as a method of treatment. Though there was resistance to slavery in both the U.S. and Europe, scientists, for the most part, continued to advance theories of racial inferiority. The abolitionist movement of the 19th century sought to humanize the plight of African slaves in various ways to influence political power and public opinion. The resistance to slavery and the image of Africans as subhuman can be found in protest hymns like Amazing Grace, which was written by John Newton in 1772 in response to the horrors he witnessed working on an English slave ship. One of the ways that race played out in popular culture was in the publication in 1852 of the most widely read novel of its time, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which depicted a more realistic portrait of slavery and tried to humanize slaves. The 19th century also marked a period of widespread racialization, not just of African Americans, but of Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and Chinese Americans as well. Much of the racializing of non-Europeans and even the Irish served an economic and political purpose. African slavery, for instance, provided free labor and added political clout for slaveholding states in the South. Taking Native American land and belittling Native American cultures was made easier by defining Native people as savages. At the end of the 19th century, the U.S. experienced another wave of European immigration. This time, the immigrants were Southern and Eastern Europeans, and their presence challenged ideas about race, specifically who was white and who was not. Unlike earlier European immigrants who were mostly German, Scandinavian, and Irish, these newer immigrants were Polish, Italian, and Jewish, and brought with them customs and traditions that were different from their European predecessors. They were often the victims of discrimination. Even U.S. immigration policy tried to limit the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe by imposing quotas. At the beginning of the 20th century, African Americans migrated north for factory jobs that opened up during World War I and to escape the violence in the South. Between 1889 and the early 1920s, roughly 50 to 100 lynchings a year took place in the U.S. While blacks were mostly the victims, Italian Americans, Asian Americans, and Jews were also lynched. Even in the North, blacks encountered racism as they competed with whites for jobs. Several northern cities, St. Louis, Tulsa, Detroit, and Chicago, among others, were the sites of major race riots from 1915 to the early 1920s. During the Depression, some race scientists sought to justify economic and social inequality by attributing certain characteristics, such as criminal behavior, work ethic, and intelligence, to race, using a theory of genetic inheritance. In other words, you were poor or a criminal or less intelligent because it was in your genes. This idea was the basis for eugenics. Charles Davenport, the director of the Eugenics Records Office, was among the scientists who promoted these ideas. The eugenicist expert testimony was influential in getting Congress to pass the Immigration Act of 1924 and provided the social framework embraced by Nazi Germany. By World War II, the U.S. had expanded the racial categories in the census to include various ethnic groups, among them Mexicans, Japanese, Indians from Asia, and Filipinos. These categories and the demographics associated with each group would be used to limit immigration, as well as provide the statistical data to analyze racial discrimination in the U.S. that followed in the post-war era. The 1950s and 60s were a time of enormous social change in the U.S. Discrimination and institutional racism were being challenged at every turn. To some extent, the racial and social hierarchies that had long been accepted were being contested. And perhaps more slowly, attitudes about race and racial difference were beginning to change. The way we view race and ethnicity today is far more complex than the simple categories in the first U.S. Census. In fact, in the 2000 census, the Mark I or more option allowed for 63 possible racial combinations, reflecting the diversity of the country. By the year 2010, the U.S. population will barely resemble what it was 400, 100, even 20 years ago. That means we will probably have to reconsider the term race and whether it is relevant to describing who and what we are.
All right. Thank you. Who am I thanking? I'm thanking the American Anthropological Association for their fine video, which they were kind enough to share with us and get me out of a vocal hole there because I could not speak very well. So I'm not... There's more to this article, and they go around to different countries. They talk about the U.S., neo-Nazism. There's a lot. It's a long article. It's honestly not very well written. I think it was translated from some other language to English, is my guess, because the way it is badly written is not like someone is a bad writer, but just like they didn't translate it well, or it wasn't... I don't know. Anyway, if you'd like to look it up, it's in globalissues.org, Article 165. It's about racism. It's just simply titled Racism. It's from August 8th, 2010. Anyway, the point of all of that long thing about racism is I wanted to complicate the idea of racism for you a little bit. Because we hear the word a lot and we think it is a specific thing that is specifically from one race against another. It's entirely to do with perceptions of race based on skin color, eye shape, hair, whatever the thing is that you use to say, well, this person is a different race from me. But as you can see, particularly from the American Anthropological Society video there, well, you can't see it, but you could hear that they spoke about is that racism evolved kind of as a technique, as an idea, and it became more specific as it went along. So it may have started as just a general sort of fear of or mistrust of difference, and once scientists, and I'm wiggling my fingers in the air in the classic air quotes thing, took over, people who tried to use science as a way of justifying their thinking, came in and started studying it. Given that they were starting from the premise that race was an actual thing, there was an actual something in you, in your blood, that made you have dark skin or light skin or round eyes or slanted eyes or whatever that thing would be that people were using as these markers of race. when scientists coming from the I guess naive point of view that these differences must mean something, and if they mean something, it must be something in the blood, in your body, some genetic thing that creates these differences. And they were right about that. There is some genetic markers in you that say, okay, you are going to be tall and skinny and fair and red hair, it's curly, and all these different things. There's something in your blood. I mean, blood is an all-purpose term for whatever your basic biological bits and pieces are. We can use the term blood to describe that, as has been so often used over the centuries. It's completely misleading, but it's still usable as a sort of an all-purpose term for your DNA, your genetics, genetic makeup, and all that stuff. Yes, there is something in there that tells your body how to express certain traits, but the differences between this tall, thin, pale person with curly red hair and that short, wide, heavy, dark-skinned person with straight, dark hair, or whatever those differences are, the actual differences that make you one way or the other are so slight as to be almost unmeasurable. So what we call race are just consistent I'm at a loss. I'm getting kind of off into talking about race here. I wanted to talk about misperceptions of racism, and I'm finding myself getting lost on a tangent here talking about race itself. But okay. let me step back from that, because I was just going on, and I could keep going on forever and talk about what race is and isn't, and why people thought or didn't think that it meant something. I mean, we all kind of know that by now, and I think I'm just sort of traveling in two worn paths here, two traveled paths, by just reiterating what we know about race. But let's get back to how race and immigration come together. So here's what I was writing earlier. I'll read some of that. I wrote, quote, "People have spent so many years defending their racist views that now racism in this country is mostly represented by neo-racists who firmly believe that if you aren't white, it's your own fault if you fit existing stereotypes about or for your particular race." And what I was trying to say there is that, once science started backing away from this idea that race was some really definitional trait that you carried in you, that you could not escape from. It's just in your blood, it's in your bones, it is what makes you who you are, and therefore things can be said about you because of your race, because of what others perceive your race to be, despite the fact that most of the exterior traits that we use to decide somebody's race don't necessarily tell us about their ethnicity or their parentage or whatever. Often they do. Often they don't. So someone can appear completely one way and really not be so genetically that way. It's so hard to talk about because, I want to say can appear to be one race but not be that race, but that's reifying race right there, and I shouldn't be doing it. So anyway, my point there was that once science started backing away from that, and people, the bottom dropped out of people's support for justifying their racism, it became harder for them to come up with a way of explaining why they were racist. So if you could say, well, I mean, look at this book here. Look at that book here. This great scientist tells me that the skulls of Asian people are larger than the skulls of the African people, or whatever that thing is. Then there was an argument to be made. Even if it was incorrect, it was at least an argument that you could make. Once you had to start backing away from that and explain why you hated this or that race, it became necessary, instead of using science and say, well, it is well-known fact that people from this subcontinent are inferior mentally or whatever, people had to come up with excuses. So I continued, I don't hate you because you're black, I hate you because you are X, Y, or Z defense has become so normalized that today's racists can almost honestly say they don't see color, since the only things they are conscious of seeing are culture, style, religion, attitude, etc. No longer is it assumed that it is because of your race that you are the way that you are. Rather, race as a term now equates with stereotype, in that it is just an identity that you can choose to inhabit or reject depending on what degree of moral fiber you have. So what I'm getting at here is that racists now justify their racism by basically blaming the people they are being racist against by saying, well, it's your fault. You chose to act black or brown or yellow or whatever their thing is. You're choosing to do that. You don't have to do that. You don't have to be that way. I'm not a racist. I don't think that you're automatically that way because you are black or brown or yellow or red. I think it is a choice you're making. It is a lack of proper upbringing that makes you behave like that. And that's what I'm prejudiced against, not your race. And so what I'm getting at here is a long way around saying that immigration and people being prejudiced against immigrants now has, whereas once there was a racial justification that people felt they could make based on science, it was scientifically shown or believed that people of this ethnicity, this race, were morally inferior or intellectually inferior or more criminally inclined or whatever that thing is. Once they stopped being able to say that, now they use the same technique, the same attitude, the same everything, but now it's shifted to its culture, its upbringing. It is your religion. People from the Middle East are, the Muslim people are more prone to violence. They are terrorists by nature. They are driven by their fanatical religion to behave like X. Whereas once it was, well, Italians are hot-blooded, so they get angry easier, or Irish tend to drink too much. Whatever these things were that people used to blame on race, they now blame on other things. But it's still racism because they still categorize people by race. They still categorize these flawed cultural what would you call it? Cultural tendencies, maybe, flawed religious belief system, flawed behavior systems. All these different things are still shoehorned into race. Race is still the signifier. It's how you tell by looking at a group of people who's going to be what way. Oh, those people are you got to watch them. They're shifty. How do you know? Well, I mean, they look like, instead of just saying, oh, well, they're black. And now it's like, well, they're kind of ghetto. Look at, it's a ghetto sort of thing. Now there are all sorts of other things that fit into these stereotypes that are just, it's like they took the stereotypes and just divided them into little bits and pieces. And now those bits and pieces are what they're prejudiced against. And they can tell to be prejudiced against those things by race. So it's just backwards now. It's just flipped completely backwards. Whereas once race was the reason for all these problems, now it's flipped around. These problems are the reason why I think people of that race are bad. and that was basically my point. And that's how this fits in with immigration, because it's easy to look at immigrants, immigrants from Mexico are, some of them are drug pushers, some of them are criminals, some of them are rapists, to quote our friend Donald Trump. Why not immigrants from Canada? Well, you can see these people are like this certain way. It's not because they are brown people. It's because they're from Mexico. It's because they're from this particular part of the world. It's because they choose, because they lack the integrity and moral fiber to be better human beings, like people from Canada or Europe. That's why they're like that. So it's now... it's just flipped around. So I went on to say maybe it's partly because science is no longer telling us that different races have different capabilities and tendencies. Maybe it's partly because familiarity engendered by years of forced integration now make it impossible to believe that perceptions of race can automatically tell you who and what someone will be. But whatever it is, it now allows millions of people to excuse their knee-jerk reactions as something other than racism, and it forms the basis of the pushback against political correctness, which is seen as a way of defending the indefensible in order to avoid the appearance of racism or sexism or any other ism. Political correctness is viewed as enabling and even encouraging bad behavior, all in the name of trying too hard to not hurt anyone's feelings by calling them out for who and what they really are. So anyway, that's part of, that's not the whole thing, but that's part of what I wrote earlier about race. And I think it's germane in the context of discussing immigration, because by broadening their critique, if I can put it that way, with racists broadening their critique away from, they're black, they're Jewish, they're Polish, they're whatever. The thing is that they once did, it was just shorthand that described everything they hated about a certain kind of people. Now they've understood there's a necessity to itemize, to specify what it is that they're racist against, and to just leave race out of the topic, as if that makes it no longer racist anymore. So it's no longer racist to say that, inner city youth have come from broken families and suffer from a deficit of culture and work ethic and this and that, and all of that is saying that it's black kids are dangerous and untrustworthy and not good workers and all sorts of different things. It's just, you're no longer saying that it's black kids, you're saying that it's inner city youth, and so on. So the same thing applies to prejudice against immigrants. In most cases, what we see are not people trying to create laws that keep out other people that look like them. You don't see anyone saying we have to restrict immigrants from England or France or Germany from coming to the United States. Once you did. Once they did not want Irish people coming. They did not want, German people during the war or whatever. There was a time that they didn't want that. But now it's only certain countries, and it just happens to be the countries where people are ethnically and visibly different. So you have Donald Trump saying we have to build a wall on the southern border between the U.S. and Mexico, a giant wall that you cannot get through. We've got those people down there are so dangerous. We have to keep them out with this giant wall because they keep coming in, and they're rapists and drug mules and whatever, So you've got that, and at the same time, we have to just, to put it in his own words, a total and complete shutdown of Muslims coming into the United States. Why? Because a few people out of the many, many many dangerous, fanatical killers that have been in this country and have committed mass murder. A few of them are a different color, a different ethnicity. They look different, so they're dangerous. The other ones, no, don't worry about them. They're individual crazy people that cannot be. There's no way to deal with them. So we can't do anything about that. Don't even look over there. Look over here at this handful that has come through because they are part of this whole dangerous part of the world, which also happens to be full of people that look different from us and are different. So all of this is racism. And all of, virtually all of anti-immigrant sentiment is racist in nature or in effect. It either comes from a place of racism, in other words, or it in effect becomes racism because the people that you are trying to keep out specifically are almost always different from you in the way they look, the way they speak, their religion, their clothing style, whatever it is. They are different enough that you can categorize them in a racial way and say there is something wrong with all those people. Some of them are good, but as Trump put it, and some of them, I suppose, are good people. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. I mean, he is the quintessential racist. I'm just going to say it. If anybody wants to complain, they're welcome to do so. But that is my opinion, not that of WRFU, UCIMC, Urbana Socialist Forum, or UPTV. It is my personal opinion. If you don't like it, talk to me about it. But that's what that stuff is. And so I just wanted to talk about that today because a lot of the time we see it backwards. It's like anti-immigrant sentiment leads to racist beliefs. Well, it's flipped around now. Racist beliefs lead to anti-immigrant sentiment. The two are linked and are very difficult to separate. It is almost impossible to make any kind of decent argument about who should and should not be allowed into this country or who deserves citizenship and who doesn't, that does not in some way end up dividing people by race. And I can't think, I mean, every now and then the anti-immigrant folks will make, economic explanations that cover various things. They say, well, we should lower the number of visas for skilled workers from anywhere. It doesn't matter where they're from. Lower the number of this. Lower, they do. The think tanks and the people that work on this stuff do sometimes make economic arguments, and sometimes with various degrees of validity. But by and large, and the vast majority of the arguments against immigrants coming to this country end up excluding people based primarily on the color of their skin, their religious affiliation, something about them that fits them into a category of difference that often ends up being defined as race. So, having said all that, I'm going to have to go. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. We will see you next week with hopefully something interesting and or different.